What kind of empire used the skin of enemies as a warning to the world? The Neo-Assyrian Empire, known as Mat-Ashur in Akkadian, was not just one of the most powerful military forces of the ancient world. It was a regime built on institutionalized terror. Between the 9th and 7th centuries BCE, Assyrian kings crafted a new kind of warfare, one where conquest was not complete until every survivor had seen the price of resistance. Terror was methodical. The aftermath of a successful siege was choreographed to send a message, not just to the defeated, but to anyone watching. Cities that dared to resist were turned into public theaters of punishment. Corpses of the fallen were strung from poles, impaled on stakes, or left to decay in the streets. Captives were mutilated and paraded through the ruins in iron shackles. These were not the acts of individual cruelty, but state-sponsored displays deeply rooted in Assyrian royal policy. Inscriptions from the reign of Ashurnasirpal II, 883–859 BCE, describe such methods with chilling detachment. "I struck down 3,000 of their warriors with the sword and took many captive. Some had their arms and hands severed, while others lost their noses, ears, or other extremities. I blinded many among them." But the most feared act was flaying, the removal of skin from the living or the dead, nailed onto walls as a dire warning. These acts were executed not by ordinary soldiers, but by state-appointed torturers and royal executioners trained for the task. Reliefs from the palace of Sennacherib at Nineveh show hooded or bare-headed men, executioners, carrying out punishments with chilling precision. These punishments were staged in public squares or outside city gates. Sometimes nobles or city rulers were made to witness the executions of their kin before being blinded, shackled, and sent in chains to Assur or Nineveh. The very layout of Assyrian capital cities included dedicated plazas for such spectacles, reinforcing submission through ritualized violence. The Assyrian use of terror was not impulsive, it was institutional. The cruelty of their campaigns was documented in stone, preserved in archives, and implemented by trained agents of the state. Terror was their empire's currency, and they spent it with brutal precision. Impalement as a warning, the Assyrian signature. Few punishments in ancient history matched the terrifying spectacle of Assyrian impalement. It was not only an execution, it was a performance, a message etched in public punishment. The Assyrians, at the height of their power in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, wielded impalement as their most iconic and horrifying instrument of terror. It was their signature method of execution, used not for expediency, but for symbolism. It turned bodies into warnings, transforming resistance into an open-air gallery of obedience through fear. Assyrian annals repeatedly describe the practice. From the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, read 745–727 BCE, we read, "I heaped up the corpses of their warriors in front of the gates. I impaled their nobles on stakes." The targets were most often local rulers, rebel leaders, or high-ranking captives, chosen specifically for the deterrent value of their suffering. These victims were impaled on tall wooden stakes, often outside the gates of their own cities. Their bodies would be left to decay, towering reminders to all who entered or exited. The Assyrians believed that a visible execution extended the punishment's effect beyond the individual, onto the minds of the living. Executioners, part of the state machinery, were trained not just in death-dealing, but in psychological messaging. The placement of the stake mattered. The height, angle, and location were all considered. A line of impaled bodies ringing a city wall was a silent, inescapable lesson. This is what awaits rebellion. Reliefs from the palace of Ashurnasirpal II at Nimrud depict these scenes in grim detail. Bodies impaled on stakes, sagging under their weight, while soldiers look on without emotion. The practice was both legal punishment and political messaging. After a siege, military scribes recorded who was impaled and why. Names and crimes were inscribed on tablets or walls nearby. The punishment was not hidden in dungeons, it was public justice, designed to collapse morale and guarantee future obedience. Assyrian impalement was not about punishment alone, it was a calculated weapon of political control. Mass deportations, controlling through fear. What kind of empire survives not by building loyalty, but by uprooting entire civilizations? The Assyrian Empire, particularly during the reigns of kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and Esarhaddon, engineered one of the most systematic policies of population control in the ancient world: mass deportation. Unlike casual displacement caused by war, this was a coldly calculated state policy designed to shatter resistance at its roots. Deportation was not a chaotic consequence of conquest, it was a strategy. When a city or region rebelled, Assyrian forces would crush it swiftly, then dismantle its social fabric. Entire populations, families, craftsmen, nobles, farmers, were torn from their homelands and marched hundreds of miles to new territories within the empire. These forced relocations were recorded in meticulous royal inscriptions and on clay tablets kept in imperial archives. Sargon II, after conquering Samaria in 722 BCE, famously stated, "I counted 27,290 people. I carried them off to Assyria." The deportees were not killed. Their lives were preserved not out of mercy, but utility. They were reassigned to faraway regions, often hostile lands recently subdued by Assyria, where their presence served two purposes: to develop agriculture and infrastructure for the empire, and to dilute the native population with foreign displaced peoples, thereby preventing further unified rebellion. Executioners and soldiers oversaw the process. Those who resisted were dealt with immediately, punished harshly, sometimes by execution or public display. Families were sometimes split, religious sites destroyed, and native languages suppressed. The psychological trauma of being uprooted, carried on foot across barren landscapes, was part of the punishment. Later classical sources, including fragments attributed to the Babylonian historian Berossus, reflect on the disorienting legacy of Assyrian deportations: entire populations uprooted, resettled among strangers, and stripped of former allegiances. While Assyrian royal inscriptions proudly list towns populated with foreign laborers and celebrate their renewed productivity, the human cost of this policy remains starkly evident. Mass deportation was the Assyrian answer to disobedience. It was not slaughter, but survival through dispersion, breaking societies apart and reassembling them as tools of empire. Burning cities alive, scorched-earth warfare. What happens when conquest isn't enough and destruction becomes the goal? For the Assyrian Empire, particularly in the reigns of Ashurnasirpal II, Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal, victory did not end with military defeat. It culminated in obliteration. Cities that resisted were not simply captured, they were annihilated, often by fire, in what historians now recognize as one of the earliest forms of scorched-earth warfare. The Assyrians didn't just punish leaders, they punished landscapes. Entire urban centers were systematically burned to ash, their temples looted, their granaries destroyed, and their people scattered or slaughtered. The act was deliberate. It served not only to cripple future resistance, but to create a memory of fear that echoed across the ancient Near East. Ashurnasirpal II described one such campaign. "I stormed the city. I destroyed, devastated, and burned it with fire. The corpses of their warriors I piled up. Their men and women I burned." Such acts weren't only recorded, they were celebrated. Palace reliefs from Nineveh and Nimrud portray the smoke-choked destruction of enemy cities, with flames rising above walls while Assyrian troops march in formation below. These images, etched into limestone and placed in royal halls, were not warnings, they were trophies. One of the most infamous examples occurred in 701 BCE during Sennacherib's campaign against the kingdom of Judah. While Jerusalem was spared after a siege, other cities like Lachish were not. Archaeological evidence confirms the entire city of Lachish was burned, its gate shrine defiled, and its defenders overwhelmed in a brutal assault. The final horror came after the fire. Survivors, if any, were often left amid the ruins with no food, water, or leadership. Temples and idols were stripped, sacred objects carted back to Assur or Nineveh as symbols of dominance. As Ashurbanipal wrote, "I carried off the gods of Elam, their treasures and people. I burned their cities. I turned them into ruin mounds." The Assyrian Empire perfected the use of fire as a political tool. Cities were not merely defeated, they were made to vanish. The message was unmistakable. Rebellion would not only fail, it would be erased from history. The Assyrian Empire's legacy is etched not only in stone reliefs and ruined cities, but in the dark mastery of fear as a tool of rule. Through calculated terror, forced exile, and the fiery erasure of entire civilizations, they reshaped the ancient Near East and exposed how empire can descend into domination through cruelty. Can the shadow of Assyria still teach us about the dangers of power without restraint? Comment below with your thoughts. As Ashurnasirpal II recorded, "In the midst of the mighty mountains I slaughtered them. With their blood I dyed the mountains red like wool."